Have you always wanted to identify the birds in your backyard? Well, in this video, I'm going to show you how to identify 34 of the most common birds found in backyards across the country. You don't need any experience to learn how to identify these birds, as I'm going to make it as easy as possible for you to follow along. First one is the Northern Cardinal, and in the eastern and midwestern United States, this is one of the most common and recognizable backyard birds. The males are a bright red color, while the females are more of a tan. The females do, however, still have some red. On their crest, wings, and tail, both the male and female both have bright red beaks. So one of the best ways to identify the Northern Cardinal is to look at that big crest. While their bright red color does make them stick out, there are some other bird species like the summer or scarlet tanagers that are bright red and can be confused. And so one of the best ways to separate them from other species is their crest. Cardinals are fairly large birds, and the only other backyard bird species with a crest is the tufted titmouse. And titmice are a lot smaller than northern cardinals. So you can look at their bright red coloring, their crest, and just their overall thick, kind of chunky shape, and that will let you know that you are looking at a cardinal. As far as range goes, they are found all over the Midwest, eastern, and southern United States, and there's also some in southeastern Arizona. Northern cardinals will regularly come to bird feeders and prefer sunflower seed. Next one is the mourning dove. Mourning doves are super common birds, and in most states, mourning doves are the only dove species, but in the south and western United States, there can be a few more. The most widespread confusion species is the Eurasian collared dove, which is not native to the United States. The best way to separate the mourning dove from the Eurasian collared dove is the lack of a collar, and mourning doves are a darker tan when compared to the Eurasian collared dove. The mourning dove also has some black spots on their wing, and one of the most interesting ways that I've come across to separate mourning doves from all other dove species is mourning doves are the only dove species in the United States that have a pointed tail. You can't always see the pointed tail, but most times you can. But if it doesn't have a pointed tail, then it definitely deserves a closer look. As far as range goes, they are found throughout the entire country, and the purple on this range map means they are found there year-round, while the orange means they are found there only during the breeding season, which is typically the summer. Next, we have a very common species, and that is the chipping sparrow. Chipping sparrows, unlike other sparrows, are often found in residential or urban areas. They're not super common feeder birds, but they will occasionally eat some seeds that are left on the ground. The easiest way to separate a chipping sparrow from all other sparrow species is this black stripe through the eye, orange cap, and then we also have a little bit of red on the wings and some white on the wings. This distinctive black and orange striped back is different than all other sparrow species that are found in backyards. And the main confusion species here would probably be the house sparrow. The house sparrow has tan lines on its back and a much thicker beak. If we look at the chipping sparrow, its beak is actually pretty thin when compared to the house sparrow. House sparrows also do not have a black line through their eye. As far as range goes, these guys are mostly a summer species. This little bit of yellow here means they're only found there during migration, and inside of that yellow area you might occasionally get a few summerine birds that just didn't migrate all the way north. Purple, like I said earlier, means they are found there year-round, and then the blue here means they are found in the winter or non-breeding season. Next, we have a very, very common species, quite possibly the most common bird on the planet, and that is the house sparrow. House sparrows are not native to the United States. They were introduced in New York City in the 1800s, I believe, but have since spread to the entire country and most of the world. House sparrows are a distinctive bird with their brown back, gray belly, and then the black around their face. They also have this very thick bill. Females are a little duller and more gray, but still have these distinctive white stripes on their back, gray flanks and belly, and then this thick bill. House sparrows also have a distinctive shape when perched. If you see a group of birds fly off into a bush and they all kind of group together in clumps, I can almost guarantee you that those are house sparrows. And so that can be a unique little behavior clue to help you identify them. And for range, like I said earlier, they are found throughout the entire United States. If we had a map of the whole world, you would see that they are found nearly everywhere. Next bird we have here is the distinctive blue jay. Blue jays are these bright blue birds with a black necklace. In most of the country, there is no jay that they can be confused for. In the western United States, you've got the Steuer's jay. Those are a lot darker blue and have a lot of black on them. And these are a very distinctive bird and pretty hard to confuse. Just look for that bright blue color. For range, they are found in the southern, midwestern, and eastern United States. And in the winter, you can find them out west. But since this is a lighter blue, that means they are not very common in the winter there. Next up is the house finch, and house finches are not actually native to the United States. This is a European bird that have been introduced, and like the house sparrow, have become very common. The males are quite easy to identify with their bright red coloring and thick bill. The main confusion species here would be the purple finch, and the purple finch is more of a raspberry color when compared to the male house finch, and also has a more distinctive eyebrow. For the female purple finch, it's a little harder. They can still be confused for the purple finch. They can also be confused for a pine siskin. Pine siskins have these really thin pointed bills. Well, if we look at the bill of a house finch, it is very bulky and more of a duller point. Pine siskins also have some yellow in their feathers, while the color of a female house finch is always brown and white. To separate from the female purple finch, house finches just kind of lack the distinctive eyebrow of a female purple finch. For range, they are found throughout the entire United States, and I think they are a little bit more common towards the western United States. Before we get on to the next bird, which is the red-winged blackbird, I just want to let you know that if you're looking for a way to identify birds, no matter where you are in the world or what species you're looking at, I've got you covered. I've made a course on an easy-to-follow 4-step formula that helps you identify every single bird. This is the formula that I'm using to identify these birds, and so if you want to be able to identify every single bird you see, you can go to betterbirders.com to check out my new course, Bird Identification for Beginners. Alright, so next we have the red-winged blackbird, and males are pretty distinctive. We got this big red patch with a little bit of yellow. Big black bird, and in flight you can see this red patch. It's pretty distinctive. There are some other blackbirds that you can confuse for the red-winged blackbird, but just look for that big red patch and you're pretty much all set. The female is a little bit more confusing. There are a few more species you can confuse it with, such as cowbirds. Look for this thin pointed bill on the red-winged blackbird, white eyebrow, and then just very streaked belly. Brown-headed cowbirds are a pretty big confusing species for red-winged blackbirds, and they have a very thick bill, so look for that thin bill and you'll be good to go. As far as range goes, we got a very common species here, found year-round throughout most of the country, and then in the north they are only found there during the breeding season. Next bird is the American goldfinch. Again, pretty distinctive bird. We got a thick orange bill, black cap, yellow body, and then these two white wing bars can be pretty helpful. When it comes to confusion species, the big one here is the lesser goldfinch if you live in the south. Otherwise, there really isn't that many. The lesser goldfinch has a lot more black on it when compared to the American goldfinch. A potential problem with goldfinches is they look very different depending on what time of the year. We have here on the left a female American goldfinch, but this one on the right is not a female or juvenile. It is actually a male, just like this one right here. But this picture right here was taken during the fall or winter, and so this bird right here has non-breeding plumage. And so in the fall, after the breeding season, male goldfinches are going to molt into a different set of feathers that are then a different color. In the spring, they'll molt back into their breeding plumage, but for the fall and winter, they look just like the female. Now, goldfinches are pretty distinctive if seen well, but if you don't get a good look at them, the best way to separate them from other finches like the house finch is to look for these white wing bars. If you notice, the house finch did not have any white on its wings, so if you see any white while a finch is flying, that means it is a goldfinch. For range, we have a very widespread bird depending on the time of year, found throughout much of the Midwest and eastern United States throughout the entire year, the southern and part of the western United States during the winter, and then up north during the breeding season. And now for the very first woodpecker on this list, we have the downy woodpecker, a very common and cute backyard bird. Best way to identify is to look for that white belly, and then we've got this white stripe on the back. That'll separate it from almost all other woodpeckers except for the hairy woodpecker, and I'll get to how to separate it here in a little bit. But first, I just want to pay a little bit of attention to the difference between the male plumage and the female's plumage. The male has this bright red dot on the back of its head, while the female does not. This is true for almost all woodpecker species. The male is going to have some more red on its head or body than the female does. One of the best ways to separate them is to look at their bill length. On a downy woodpecker, they have a much shorter bill than that of the hairy woodpecker. The general rule of thumb is the hairy woodpecker's bill covers roughly the length of its head, while the downy woodpecker is barely even halfway across the head. Size is also a good way to separate them, but size can be just really tricky to judge depending on how far away you are from the bird. For range, we have a very widespread bird that is generally less common in the south, and in the southwestern United States is virtually non-existent. Another woodpecker here is the red-bellied woodpecker. It gets its name after this little bit of red coloring on its belly, and while you might notice its bright red head and think that it should be named the red-headed woodpecker, it actually has a little bit of red on its belly, and the red-headed woodpecker is already taken. Throughout most of its range, the red-bellied woodpecker is very distinctive. We have this distinctive laddered back and then red head with the white belly and a very long bill. It's very hard to confuse this species unless you're in Texas, which also has the golden-fronted woodpecker, and golden-fronted woodpeckers look a lot like this woodpecker. They just have a more gold head. For range, it's mostly a Midwestern and Southern bird, and in the Western United States, you will probably never see it. Next one is the tufted titmouse. Very cute gray bird with some orange on its sides. We also have this distinctive crest, which gives it a very distinctive shape that you can easily identify it from. We've got a very short bill and a fairly long tail. This is a very active bird that moves around a lot. You'll rarely ever see them just perching still, and they are very common at bird feeders. And for range, we have another Midwestern bird, and Texas has another titmouse, the black-crested titmouse. If seen well, it's very easy to separate a black-crested titmouse from a tufted titmouse. However, there is one problem, and that is tufted titmice and black-crested titmice will hybridize. So in most of Texas, you have these very confusing hybrids that are extremely hard to identify, but if you don't live in Texas, then you don't have to worry about that at all. Next up, we have the Carolina wren. We got a brown wren with a white eyebrow. That's pretty distinctive. I can't really think of any birds that could be confused for the Carolina wren. If you don't get a good look, I guess it could be confused for the house wren just because their shape is pretty similar. Wren family all has very distinctive shapes that you can easily tell that they are a wren. The Carolina wren has a brown back and some brown on the belly, which will separate it from almost all other species of wrens. And the only other wren to have a white eyebrow in the United States is the winter wren, which occasionally has a pretty faint eyebrow. Carolina wren is mostly a Midwestern and Southern species, although it is expanding its range farther north, and so if you're in the north, be on the lookout for these guys. Next up is a species of woodpecker called the Northern Flicker. As far as shape goes, these guys are pretty similar to the red-bellied woodpecker. They're about the same size. Northern Flicker has these black spotting, big black chest patch, and the males have some red on the back of their head. We've also got this kind of distinctive barring or spotting on the back. It also has a clean gray head, which is unlike all other species of woodpecker in the United States. Another interesting fact about the Northern Flicker is one of their favorite food is ants. So you can often see them on the ground looking for ants or hanging out by an ant mound in search of ants. There's also two main forms of Northern Flicker. We have the red-shafted Northern Flicker and the yellow-shafted Northern Flicker. This is mostly a range difference, the red-shafted on one side of the country and the yellow-shafted on the other side of the country. In the middle of the country, though, they both mate together and they do hybridize. These two different forms of the Northern Flicker were also once considered two separate species, but they have since been lumped together. As far as range goes, again, a very widespread bird. They stay put for most of the year, but in the winter, some will head farther south, and in the summer, some will head farther north. Next one is the northern mockingbird, which is a very distinctive gray bird. They got these two white wing bars, a long gray tail, and then just an overall a gray body. It's pretty hard to confuse these guys. When flying, these two white wing bars are very noticeable. They create like kind of two big flashes of white when they're flying. You could confuse that for a loggerhead shrike in the south. But other than that, northern mockingbirds are pretty distinctive. Mockingbirds also have a pretty distinctive posture. They sometimes will hold their tail up like a wren. As far as range goes, they are found throughout the entire United States, and they seem to be very, very common in the southern United States. Next up, we have the yellow-rumped warbler, and this is more of a tricky one because there are several different forms of the yellow-rumped warbler. This subspecies right here is the myrtle subspecies, and this one right here is the Audubon subspecies. Audubon subspecies is usually found in the west, while the myrtle subspecies is more widespread and found throughout the entire country. When it comes to identifying them, look for that distinctive yellow rump. We got the black mask, and these black stripes that go down the body, and warblers, like the yellow-rumped, are very small birds, probably about the size of a titmouse or a chickadee, and the yellow-rumped warbler is one of the most widespread warblers in the United States. On the myrtle subspecies, you can also look for this white throat. We also have an incomplete white eye ring right here on the top and the bottom, and when combined with the black mask, it's quite distinctive. For the Audubon subspecies, we have a gray warbler with a yellow throat patch, still some yellow on the rump, and yellow on the flanks. The Audubon subspecies of the yellow-rumped warbler is a little bit more of a lighter gray than the color of the myrtle subspecies. For range, we have a pretty complicated range map here. For the non-breeding season, they're found throughout the Midwestern and Southern United States, as well as part of Arizona, Colorado, Oregon, and Washington. And then this yellow here represents migration, and their breeding range does go north into Canada, where most of them breed. And if you're getting value out of this video, I would really appreciate it if you tap the like button, as it helps this video spread to more bird watchers just like you. So the next bird we have here is the rock pigeon, and these pigeons are very, very common in the cities. You can also find them in your backyard occasionally. Most pigeons will look like this. We've got a gray bird, white scaling on the back, and then some iridescence in the neck feathers. They also have some distinctive red feet. Overall, a very distinctive bird. When it comes to range, they are found throughout the entire United States and also found throughout most of the world. Next up, we have another member of the blackbird family, and that is the common grackle. Common grackles are very large, noisy, and iridescent birds, but structurally, the common grackle has a lot of distinctive field marks. We have this very thick, long bill and long tail. The only two species that you could have trouble with are the great-tailed grackle and the boat-tailed grackle. On the East Coast, there are some boat-tailed grackles, but those are mostly confined to the coast. So if you live away from the coast, you're probably not going to have any trouble with those. The way to separate them both is just boat-tailed grackles and great-tailed grackles have longer tails than the common grackle. Common grackles also have this like whitish eye, which is quite distinctive, and is a good way to separate them from the red-winged blackbird. Next up, we have the very common and recognizable Carolina and black-capped chickadees. These two birds look very similar. Range is usually the best way to separate them, unless you happen to live in a small portion of the country where these two birds' ranges overlap. As far as identifying them goes, you got a black cap, black chin patch, and just overall a gray bird. Also have some white on the cheeks and nape. If you look at the overall shape of the bird, you have a pretty plumped body with a longish tail. Here's the two birds side by side. Here on the right we've got the Carolina chickadee, and on the left we have the black-capped chickadee. The main way to separate them is black-capped chickadee is just more white, especially on the flanks and behind the neck. Another good way to separate them is by voice. Here is the range of the Carolina chickadee, and then here's the range of the black-capped chickadee. So as you can see, there's a bit of overlap between these two, and these two birds do hybridize in that range, making it pretty confusing to separate them, but in most places they're pretty easy to identify. The next bird is the gray catbird. We've got a dark gray bird with a black cap. There's really not very many species that this can be confused with. Just pay attention to black cap, long black tail, and then just a pretty dark bird. The reason they're called a catbird is because some of their calls do sound a lot like cats, so if you think you hear a cat in the bushes, it could be one of these guys. For most of the country, this is a summer bird. They migrate farther south to spend the winter, but on the East Coast they can be found there year-round. We have a sparrow next, and that is the white-throated sparrow. There's a lot of field marks on this bird, so I'll try to break it down as slowly as possible. So first up, we have its namesake white throat. We also have a brown back with some white tips on the feathers. We can also look at its white eyebrow here, and this little bit of yellow right here is in an area called the lore. And depending on what part of the country you're in, the amount of yellow on here could be different. We also have a black head with this white stripe running straight down the head. If we just kind of zoom out a little bit and look at the overall body shape, we see a pretty plump bird with a long tail. The white crowned sparrow, which is its main confusing species, it has a more elongated and upright posture, while the white-throated sparrow kind of seems more tucked in. Here's another example of some lore variation. As you can see, the yellow on this bird is a lot more significant than the last bird. For range, this is a winter bird for most of the country. In certain places on the East Coast, though, they can be found there year-round. The majority of the population breeds farther north in Canada. The next bird is the common eastern bluebird. This is the most widespread bluebird of the country, and it's pretty distinctive too. We've got a bright blue back and then a chestnut flank and chest. The female is a little bit duller, but still has this chestnut chest and blue back. Bluebirds are members of the thrush family, which means they have a more upright posture when compared to species like the chickadee. And so a good structural field mark is to look at their head, which is pretty upright and rounded. They also have a pretty thick bill. In the south, these birds are found there year-round. In the winter, sometimes they'll head a little bit farther west, and then for the breeding season, they head north. Next, we have the distinctive brown-headed cowbird. The females, however, are less distinctive. They're more of a gray color, while the males have a brown head and a black back. The best way to identify a cowbird is to look at its bill. We've got this very, very thick bill. And cowbirds are members of the blackbird family, which all other members of the blackbird family have these very thin, pointed bills, so the best way to separate them is to look at their bill. For range, they're found year-round throughout a lot of the Midwest and southern United States, and then for the summer, they head north across much of the western United States. Next, we have a very common but easily identified flycatcher, and that is the eastern phoebe. Phoebes have very few field marks, and that's actually one of the best ways to identify them. They don't really have much of a wing bar, and they're just overall very gray with a white belly. A good way to identify a phoebe is to look for that slightly forked tail, and then, like I said earlier, just a lack of overall field marks. We have this black head and a white belly, and then no wing bars. Almost all of their flycatchers have white wing bars, and so that can be a good way to identify them. For range, they're found throughout much of the Midwest and East Coast during the summer, and then their wintering range overlaps with where they're found year-round. Next, we have the ruby-crowned kinglet, and unfortunately, you can't always see its bright red crown. Most of the time, they just look like this. Ruby-crowned kinglets are very, very small birds, and so size is often a great way to separate them from other species, but we can also look at this very, very thin, long bill. They also got two white wing bars, and they also have an interesting eye ring. But you usually don't get this close to ruby-crowned kinglets, and so a good way to identify them based on behavior is ruby-crowned kinglets are always kind of flicking their wings when they're foraging for food. For range, we have a winter bird for most of the country, and then for a lot of people, the only way to see them is during migration, which is in the spring and fall. A lot of the population breeds further north in Canada. Next, we have the hairy woodpecker. I was talking about the downy woodpecker earlier, and this is the hairy woodpecker. They look very similar, but like I said earlier, one of the best ways to separate them is to look at their bill length. A hairy woodpecker's bill length is roughly the size of its head, while a downy woodpecker, it's usually about half. Another good way to separate the hairy woodpecker from the downy, hairy woodpecker's tail feathers, this white right here, is usually clean. There are some examples of hairy woodpeckers having some black spotting on them, but most of the time the downy woodpecker is going to be the only one that has black spotting on its tail. For range, we have a fairly common bird, a little bit less common than the downy woodpecker, and in the south they are a lot less common than they are in the north. And in the west, they're typically found in mountainous regions. Next up is the house wren. Again, a very plain bird. They have their distinctive wren shape with their tail kind of cocked up like that. And house wrens, unlike the winter wren, which is its main confusion species, do not have that distinctive of a white eyebrow. For most of the country, house wrens are a summer species, while winter wrens are more of a winter species. Next up, we have one of my personal favorite birds, and that is the cedar waxwing. They get their name from what looks like yellow wax dipped on the very end of their tail. Overall, we have a tan bird with a very distinctive black mask and then a yellow wash on the flanks. Waxwings have a very clean look with no streaks or spotting, and a good way to identify them is by their crests. Like I said earlier, titmice and cardinals both have crests, but the cedar waxwing is smaller than a cardinal and bigger than a titmouse, and cedar waxwings are almost always found in flocks. Waxwings are more of a northern species. For the breeding season, some will head north to Canada, while others will just stay where they are year-round. Barn swallows are the most common swallow species in the United States, and are also one of the most distinctive. Barn swallows have this very long tail, and that is the best way to separate them, is to just look at their tail. Their tail feathers are almost the length of their body, and so that's a really good way to separate them from all other swallow species, which have much shorter tails. Almost all swallows will spend the winter in South America, and barn swallows are no different. The only time to find the barn swallow is during the breeding season. Next up, we have an introduced species, and that is the European starling. European starlings are very distinctive birds and are also one of the most common. Starlings have this bright yellow bill and an iridescent black body with white-tipped feathers. They also have this distinctive shape when perched and a very distinctive shape when flying that kind of forms like a triangle. For range, they're found throughout the entire country. Next up, we have the American robin, again a very distinctive species. We got this bright orange breast, yellow beak, and black head. Robins are members of the thrush family, so they're going to have a more upright posture, and you can often find them foraging for worms in your backyard. When it comes to separating them from other species, since they're in the thrush family, you could confuse robins for other thrush species, but robins will always have this orange breast, while all thrushes are generally brown. And contrary to what most people think, robins do not actually show up in the spring. Throughout much of their range, they are found there year-round. They do migrate north in the spring, in the northern United States and especially Canada, but throughout much of their range, they are found there year-round. Typically, their diet will shift from earthworms in the summer to berries in the fall and winter. Speaking of winter, we have a winter bird here, and that is the dark-eyed junco. This is the most common subspecies, and this is the slate-colored subspecies. We have a black sparrow with white belly and then this distinctive pink bill. Overall, the slate-colored subspecies of the dark-eyed junco is quite distinctive. The problem is that there are a lot more subspecies. We have the slate-colored subspecies, the Oregon subspecies, I believe this is the red-backed subspecies, this is the pink-sided subspecies, and then the gray-headed subspecies. Throughout all those subspecies, their structure is the same. We have a plump sparrow with a long tail and a pink bill. Like I mentioned earlier, these are mostly winter birds. However, in the western United States, which is where most of the subspecies are, they can be found there year-round. All of the eastern United States is going to have these slate-colored subspecies, and there's also another subspecies, I believe it's the cismontis subspecies, which is pretty rare but occasionally seen in the Midwest. Next, we have a common nuthatch species, and that is the white-breasted nuthatch. A very distinctive bird with a black head, black nape, and this very long bill. A good way to separate nuthatches from all other species is to look at that bill, very thin and very long. And when a nuthatch is on a tree, they kind of climb their way around it, which the only other bird that would do that is either a nuthatch or a brown creeper. As far as range goes, they are found year-round throughout much of the country, and in the Great Plains region, they are occasionally found there during the winter. Next bird is the American crow, and crows are a very common species found throughout almost the entire country. There are a few confusion species here. The most common is going to be the fish crow, found in the southern and eastern United States. There's really not a great way to separate them. Best way is to separate by sound, but that's pretty complicated, and I'm not going to get into that here. As far as range goes, they stay put throughout most of the year. Occasionally in the winter, you could get some that go a little bit farther west in Texas and New Mexico, and then during the breeding season, some will head north. Next bird is the brown thrasher, and this is a very common species, especially in the south. Very distinctive too. So we have a overall brown bird with an extremely long tail. It's very easily noticeable. Brown thrasher also has black spots up against a white belly, and then a very long bill. Brown thrashers will sometimes be out in the open, but most of the time you're going to find them deep in the thickest brush. So when you're trying to identify them, look for that long bill, brown back, and then the very long tail. As far as range goes, they're found year-round in the south and head farther north in the summer, and then in Texas they are only found there in the winter. And the last bird that we have here is the turkey vulture. There's only one vulture species that this can be confused with in the country, and that is the black vulture. Black vultures have shorter wings and also have silvery wingtips, unlike the turkey vulture. Black vultures are also found only in the south. The best way to separate a turkey vulture from a hawk is turkey vultures typically hold their wings in a V shape, and turkey vultures are all black except for the little bit of red on their head, while hawks are often red, white, gray, and many other colors. Well, you might not notice it, turkey vultures actually head south in the winter. They come north during the breeding season and are found year-round in the southern United States. So that's all the birds that I've got for you, and if you want to go deeper into bird identification, make sure you go check out my course, Bird Identification for Beginners, where I lay out a easy-to-follow 4-step framework for identifying every bird that you see. So go to betterbirders.com to get started on your journey to becoming a master at bird identification today.